Hello everyone to our live stream. We are here in Kranjska Gora at an event joining many young people from all around Europe to discuss politics, the European Union and the future that lies ahead of us. So today we might be interrupted or there might be some voices in the background, so don't be confused by that. This is just young people being active European citizens discussing new ideas and new policies. So we're very happy that you're with us today for this live stream on European Union. And we're going to start by the discussion about European institutions. Because when you ask people what associations they get in their minds when they think about the European Union, and especially if you ask the Eurosceptics, they're going to say that the European Union is just a bunch of institutions. Well, we would argue that the European Union is much more than that, but to a large degree, those people are right. European Union is also about institutions, institutions that are very important for daily functioning of our lives. So what are these institutions that those people talk about? I'm going to discuss the three main institutions of the European Union today. The ones that we call the institutional triangle. So the three most important institutions that the European Union has. And these are the European Commission, the European Parliament, and Council of the European Union. Now, to make it a little bit more understandable, we can draw parallels with how national states are governed and run. So, the European Commission has a role that is similar that in nation states governments have. So, what is the European Commission? A European Commission is a body comprised of 28 commissioners and headed by the President of the European Commission. The role of the European Commission is to present the European as a whole. And so these commissioners that I mentioned before, each of them comes from one member state. And they are nominated by member state governments for the position on the European Commission, and then they're confirmed by the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union. So we have this body of 28 commissioners, and each commissioner covers one part of the European Union, of the areas that the European Union covers. So currently we have 28 member states, we have 28 commissioners, and we have 28 different, in nation states we would call them ministries. So we have a commissioner that deals with infrastructure, and we even have a commissioner that deals specifically with space exploration. As many member states, that many commissioners. And as I said before, the role of the European Commission is to represent the European Union as a whole. And this is especially important when it comes to relations with third states. And so here the European Commission takes the most important role in comparison with other institutions. It is the body that presents the European Union to the outside world. But apart from that, the European Commission has duties that are again very similar to the duties of state governments. These duties are the oversight of legislation and enforcement of the EU legislation. So the European Commission has to make sure that the legislation that is in place is actually being enforced. Secondly, the European Commission proposes a budget. So it sets out a plan how the European funds should be divided, who should get which program should get what amount of money. And thirdly, the European Commission proposes new legislation. So it drafts the legislation, and then it sends the legislation for approval to the European Parliament and to the Council and to the Council of the European Union. One important thing about the European Commission is that it is a collective body, and it takes collective responsibility. And in practice, this means that the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union, they confirm the European Commission as a whole. So if one of the commissioners makes a mistake, that commissioner cannot be fired and cannot be just removed from the European Commission. No, either the European Commission takes the responsibility as a whole and we get a new European Commission, or nothing is changed in an institutional sense. Currently, the president of the European Commission is Jean-Claude Juncker, who was previously Prime Minister of Luxembourg. And usually, the party that wins the European elections is the ones that nominates the president of the European Commission. So this leads us to the second body that forms the institutional triangle, and this is the European Parliament. So I mentioned before that the European party that wins the European elections then nominates the president of the European Commission. So what are these European elections that I mentioned before? European elections, the next one are happening in just over 2 weeks all around Europe, are an event that joins 500 million of global population, and this 500 million of population has the duty to elect representatives. The representatives that are then elected are called members of the European Union, and their duty is to present the interests and wishes of the European citizens. So the European Parliament is also the only directly elected body of the European Union. And it is very important because of the duties it plays. But before we talk about the duties, let's talk a bit more about the composition of the European Parliament. European Parliament is comprised of 753 directly elected members, and from each member state there comes a number of MEPs, as they are called, that is relative to the population of the country. So Slovenia, for example, has 8 members of the parliament, since it has about 2 million of population, whereas Germany, which has around 80 million inhabitants, has around 100 MEPs. So you see that it's not completely proportional. Smaller member states are favored, have a proportionally bigger representation, but the general rule is that the seats are divided based on the population of specific member states. So these MEPs, or candidates for the European elections, are usually members of their own national parties, right? They're members of, conservative national parties or social democrat national parties, liberal parties, whatever. But what is interesting is that as soon as they get elected to the European Parliament, they usually form a group with members from other states that share similar views. So the group of mainly conservative and center-right members of the European Parliament, who come from many, many different national parties, form the largest parliamentary group in the European Parliament. It's called the European People's Party. The second largest one is the one that represents the center-left of the European politics, and it's called the Socialist and Social Democratic Party of the European Union. So what happens then after elections is that you have parties in the European Parliament, and they function in a similar way than the parties in the national parliaments function. The one difference is that coalitions are not formed explicitly. The forming of coalitions is not institutionalized, but what is important is that party with the largest share of the vote is the one that nominates the president of the European Commission. And this is an informal rule, but one that is in practice in the last few election cycles. So the duty of the European Parliament is to approve or reject legislation that is set forward by the European Parliament. It also supervises bodies and institutions of the European Union, including the European Commission. It has the power to remove and to confirm the European Commission, and it also votes on agreements that the European Union makes with other states. But these powers are not exclusively the authority of the European Parliament. These powers are shared with the third institution that forms the institutional triangle, and this is Council of the European Union. Now, if we said before that the European Commission represents the European Union as a whole, and that the members of the European Parliament or the European Parliament represent the interests of the European citizens, then we have the Council of the European Union, which represents the interests of the member states. So, in the Council of the European Union, you have ministers from governments of member states that are there to represent the interests of those member states. And it depends on what's the topic at hand, who these ministers are going to be. For example, if there's a discussion on agriculture, we're going to have an agricultural ministers from the European Union gathered. If there's discussion on, monetary policy, there are probably going to be finance ministers from the member states of the European Union. And as I said, they have a similar role as the European Parliament. They also have to accept or reject laws that are set forward by the European Commission, and they also confirm the European Commission as a whole. Now, one other institution that is very similar in the name to the Council of the European Union is the European Council. Now, when we talk about the European Council, we talk about a gathering of head of governments of member states. So, and this is an area where the European Union and the institution of the European Union can get confusing and difficult to understand, because there are just so many expressions and they're very similar. So when you have heads of government, so usually prime ministers, together in the same room having a meeting, that's usually the meeting of the European Council. European Council is officially not part of the institutional triangle, but it has a task of setting the guidance for the three institutions I talk about. So it sets the general political agenda that these institutions should take. And another thing that we should clarify, which is also very confusing, is that we also have a third similarly named institution, and this is Council of Europe. Now, Council of Europe has nothing to do with the European Union. It's a completely separate institution with headquarters in Strasbourg, and it has 47 member states from all around Europe, and it's an international organization that was formed after the end of the Cold War to promote democracy, human rights, and rule of law all around Europe. So this is not connected to the European Union institutions, but it's something that is separate. So now I've told you a bit about the three most important institutions, the ones that take the decisions that form policies that impact our lives. And probably you notice that there's a very nice balance in these institutions, how on the one hand interests of the citizens are represented, on the other hand we have interests of the member states being represented. So there is this eternal clash in the European Union between the supranationality, so European Union being more than just union of independent sovereign states, but it's something that generates power on its own, and this power derives from the citizens. But on the other hand, and this is a view that is very favored by member states themselves, is that the European Union is to a certain degree an intergovernmental institution of member states. So that's why you have this institutional balance. So the legislative is decided on one hand by the European Parliament, on the other hand by the Council of the European Union, and then you have the Commission, which should represent those two elements and join them together and represent the European Union as a whole. So in this institutional triangle, in theory, balance is created, and that is how our European Union is being led. So thank you for listening to my part, and I'm sure you enjoy Ivan's, Nena, and Matija's contributions too. Thank you.
The project of European integration has been a project that we can divide in 5 steps, with the 5th step currently in future because it has not been reached yet as of 2019. First of all, when we do this short introduction to the topic, we're going to talk about the 5 different steps, and then we're going to discuss them historically, put them into their historical setting, and then we shall discuss the options of, reaching the end of the European integration project to conclude. So, the 5 steps of economic integration. The default for countries in the modern international community is to trade and cooperate economically as separate sovereign entities, which means that often when we talk about economy, goods and products and services are placed under custom laws and tariff laws, which means that you cannot import something to a different country without paying a tax that we call a tariff or a custom. Countries have realized then, in some occurrences, we're going to talk about how this happens in Europe later on, that this perhaps is not the most optimum solution for their economies, and they have decided to lift customs or tariffs for certain goods or certain markets. That is the first step of economic integration. It is a free trade area, so to speak, and a very good example of that would be NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which means that goods are now not placed under any customs, that the export and import of goods, which obviously includes everything from basic resources such as oil or metals, or towards also finished goods, and basically there is now no barriers for trade of those goods. That's the first step. The second step, when that happens, is to develop a customs union. Now, why does that step follow? When you have country A and country B that are in a free trade agreement, that means that goods from country A can travel to country B without any excessive fiscal cost. A country C, which is not in the free trade agreement, might realize that it is cheaper to import into country A because country A has lower tariffs, and then from country A they can sell on to country B, right? For example, if Germany and France have different tariffs for steel, for instance, Germany would have 3% and France would have 5%. Morocco, who is not in the free trade agreement, could say, it makes sense for us to import to Germany, and then from Germany we can go on to France, right? And to avoid such mismatches of customs and tariffs, countries can deepen their economic cooperation, and they do that to form a common customs setting for all the excluded exterior countries. So, for instance, if France and Germany now had a free trade agreement and they go on to the second stage, which is customs unions, they set the same custom, the same tariff number, setting, percentage, whatever, for everyone outside, which also means that the trade deals that they sign together, and they cooperate as one trading bloc on the outside, right? For example, the European Union can, because of that, sign trade deals with other countries on the planet as a common collective because it is in a customs union. The third stage is to have a common market. A common market means that not only do you have the same customs setting, not only do you have free trade, but also that this free trade is extended beyond goods, right? And what does that mean? That means that beyond goods you have 3 other things that are now traded, if you say freely, but rather we say that they have free flow. And this is first of all labor, which means people, that people can cross from one country to another, live in other countries, work in other countries, most importantly, without, requiring work visas or any additional taxes. Second of all, for services to be able to flow across borders without any additional paying taxes, etc. And fourthly, perhaps most importantly for a lot of experts, free flow of capital, which means that also financial capital and other forms of capital can move from one country to another freely, which is crucial for economic integration. And countries do that because that deepens their economic integration and cooperation even more, which, if you subscribe to certain theories of economics, leads to higher growth and higher output for the economies, and certainly we have seen that in Europe when that was implemented. The fourth stage is to have an economic and monetary union. That means that not only you do all the things that you had before, but rather you also have the same fiscal and same monetary policy. That means that you have same macroeconomic policy in terms of having the same currency, perhaps, having the same credit rates for banks to take loans out of central banks. That means that you have, when you talk about the fiscal part of it, the same taxes for the whole area that cooperates. And this once again helps to, stabilize the whole area, and that helps to make sure that economic integration can happen in a more sustainable way, because there is no, mismatches where one country has higher taxes on something and the other has lower taxes. For instance, the current problem in the European space with the taxes is that, if I have a very trivial example for you, when Apple products are, priced the same all around the world, in Europe, now the prices for Apple products are actually different from country to country. Why? Because taxes are different. And then the fifth stage, the holy grail, so to speak, of economic integration, this has not been reached yet by anyone, is to have a political union. Political union means that you have common foreign policy in its totality, that you have integration of policy in all levels, not only economic. But as I said, perhaps this is an ideal that we shall never see. More on that a bit later on. Right, now that we understand this, let us go into analysis of how this progress developed in the European space. And we have to note here that European space is quite unique because there has been no such example around the world outside of the European project. First of all, we had the European Steel and Coal Community, formed in 1952. That was when it came into existence, when the treaty was ratified. It was actually announced, 69 years ago today, in 1950, by Robert Schuman, the French foreign minister, on 9th of May, which is why we celebrate it as the Day of Europe. And that organization for coal and steel established a free trade area between the 6 countries. Those were the Benelux countries, Italy, France, and Western Germany. Right? For coal and steel, the trade was free, the barriers were lifted. The massive success of this community was followed by another quite soon after that. In 1957, the European Economic Community was formed, and it is established a free trade area for the same 6 countries for all products. And then 10 years later, it established also a customs union for the countries involved. At that time, it was still the original 6. Because of various reasons, some of them political, some of them connected to the oil crisis, there weren't any big expansions in the 70s and the 80s, but then finally the project of establishing a common market, which was already signaled before, was finally finished with the 4 freedoms that I mentioned earlier, with the Maastricht Treaty in the early 90s. That is when Europe finally got the common market. Soon after that, in the 90s, with the Amsterdam Treaty, with the establishment of the European Central Bank, a big push towards the 4th stage, the economic and monetary union, did occur. And as of right now, Europe does have the currency euro, does have the European Central Bank, which dictates monetary policy for the member states. But still, the 4th stage has not been reached completely, because fiscal levels of taxes, as mentioned earlier, with the trivial example of Apple, still are not unified. So Europe is now still on the verge of, actually going and getting the fourth stage. Currently, European Union is facing several problems that are perhaps more important. In the early 2000s, because of the large expansion of the 10 countries in 2004 and the Lisbon Treaty that redefined the institutions of the EU, because of that reason, the fiscal union was pushed to the sidelines a bit, but then currently with the crisis of 2008 that's still impacting the political sphere, and because of the refugee crisis in 2015, because of Euroscepticism, further deepening of economic integration within the European Union is not something we would expect in the near future. However, most experts would agree that in the next decade or so, until 2030, we might get another European treaty that would follow the Lisbon Treaty, that would perhaps instill a common fiscal policy for all the countries. However, the condition for this is that Euroscepticism is defeated, because Euroscepticism, but as it exists right now, is what prevents further deepening of economic ties. And a very important argument here that countries employ is that having a unified policy with taxes also means that you have diminished sovereignty for countries, because they are now unable to set their own tax levels, to set their own fiscal policy, which can be for countries quite traumatic, especially in current times where lack of trust in the European Union is present in many members of the Union. However, the latest barometer results taken in April are suggesting that majority of European citizens still believe in the European project. That number is 65% on average around the Union, and perhaps after the problem of Brexit is resolved, new optimism can fill the European project. However, the final goal, the fifth goal of a political union, seems at this point very unrealistic. The idea of European constitution was on the table before, but it was not successful. There were several, ideas of doing that beforehand. However, before common fiscal policy, that is just a far-fetched dream, because countries are too reluctant to put their sovereignty on the table and to, trust and follow the European Union that would make all the decisions on their own. However, this is something that we can look for the future to discuss. So, in order to conclude, let us bring the most important take back of this historical analysis, because it is not only that the EU in itself is very interesting, the EU is actually, as said before, a model for the whole world. So it's really important to understand that integration between countries going forward and forming a sort of a global community with sort of a global government, as many people believed United Nations would be, we tell you that cannot happen instantaneously. That can only happen through a very slow process, I'm very sorry, of economic integration. As said, the 5 stages we've already mentioned, but this is really important because it illustrates to us that international relations are run on trust, and trust is something that can only be built in a very long span, following positive experiences in some areas and then expanding that to other areas. For instance, we've seen that the European project started with only coal and steel, which might seem very miniature of a project compared to what the European Union is right now, when it has immense power, when it controls the largest trading bloc in the world. So basically, we could go back to Jean Monnet, who was the father basically the main inventor of the idea of the European project, when he already said that, you know, countries need to have to start slow and then they can continue. I'm not sure that he could imagine what a giant success the European Union could have become back in the late 40s, early 50s. But I tell you that, you know, we can apply ourselves to that situation and say that perhaps the European Union has a very, very bright future, even brighter we could imagine, and the history will tell and unfold itself. That would be it. And if I understand correctly the format, there are questions? No? Okay, then I'm very grateful for the attention. Thank you.
For everyone that might be confused, today is not actually the day of Europe. It was yesterday, but Matija got a little bit confused with the dates. But if we go to our theme now, that is actually the EU and human rights and the values of the citizens of the European Union, those are really important for the European Union, for the institutions of the European Union. But firstly, we have to start from the beginning. We have to realize that the European Union was not made firstly as a political organization. It was made as an economic organization, as we know for coal and steel. So in the beginnings in the European Union, the human rights and the values weren't so important for them. Yes, they were important, but not as much as they developed later on. So firstly, we have to realize that the whole process of the human rights developing in the European Union took a little bit more time. It took a little bit of more treaties, from the Amsterdam Treaty, the Lisbon Treaty. And we have to realize that the process was really, really successful. The European Union is one of the organizations that is most in favor of human rights, that respects the human rights the most. Yeah, if we go now to how basically the human rights in the European Union work, we have three main, we can say, institutions that work within the human rights. So firstly, we have the Court of the European Union. Secondly, we have the Protector of the Human Rights of the European Union. And thirdly, we have the Agency for the Human Rights in the European Union. So as we can see, we have three main institutions that work with human rights in the European Union. The importance of these institutions, the most important institution is definitely the Court of the European Union. The second most important is the Protector of the Human Rights, because those are the protectors from all the Europe, from all the countries that meet in the summit, and they discuss the major problems that are happening in the European Union, the major problems that are happening in human rights within the countries, and then they discuss it on a summit. And now, what are the most important human rights for the European Union? Definitely, we have to say that the dignity of the citizens of the European Union is the most important thing for the whole institutions of the European Union. The secondly, the justice. The European Union gives a lot of credit for the justice systems that work within the countries and also that work in the European Union, as I previously mentioned, the Court of the European Union. So these are the really important rights. The justice, we have to realize that the European Union, as they respect the justice system, as they respect the human rights, that every citizen should have a justice system that works properly, they basically defend the whole system of human rights, that actually everyone can access the human rights that they deserve. And if we go back to the development of the human rights, it is actually funny that we say that in the Lisbon Treaty is the first treaty that we get like the main human rights written down, that we get the whole institution, as we talk, the three main institutions. That was the first treaty where we got all of the three written down, named, and what are their functions. But even previously, they did have the institutions that were protecting the human rights in Europe. And now if we talk about how basically the European Union works also with other organizations. European Union works with the United Nations. It also cooperates with the other organizations in Europe. So we can see here that the European Union not only works within the countries, but also within the countries that are not members of the European Union. And here we have one problem, because a lot of people are saying that the European Union is very strict with the countries that try to be members of the European Union, that they really examine the human rights there, but they don't really examine the human rights within the countries that are already members of the European Union. But we can say that is they have those that are not, that those that are in the countries that are members of the European Union, they have the institutional system that works, that they can apply for. And the countries that are maybe not in the European Union, they don't have the possibility to apply, for example, to the Court of the European Union. That is why maybe sometimes it seems that the European Union is stricter with the countries that are not members of the European Union, but they want to be members in the near future. And if we talk about the major problems that are now happening with human rights in the European Union is nowadays talking a lot about the rights that are in connection with internet. The right to privacy, the right to be forgotten. That are main issues that are happening now on the global level, and also we can see that in the European Union the MPs and also the European Commission are talking about that, because as we can see they try to make a step forward to protect our human rights. And that is a really important lesson to learn. The European Union, the human rights was a long way of development. They were developing the human rights step by step, and nowadays I believe that we can be happy that we live in the European Union, because we have the right to apply if our rights are being violated. And if we go to the most important document from the European Union, is definitely the European Union Charter on Fundamental Rights that was written in the European Union, and is one of the primary sources for the law in the European Union. So we can see that the European Union is protecting the human rights, and I believe that in the near future we will have a development, and it will develop even more, and that we can be proud of where we live in nowadays. And of course, I hope that in the near future the European Union will develop its rights, our rights, even more. Thank you for listening.
Okay, hi, I'm Ivan. And so the last three speakers gave you more like a description about how the European Union functions, what the whole point is, how it looks like. I'm going to go more into like raising questions and like interesting ideas about how we can look at the European Union, and specifically how we can look at something called European identity, right? Because if I ask you, or if I ask myself, who am I, or who you are, what is your most defining feature? What's the one thing where you would say this is what you are, right? And for most of us, our kind of first response to this question would be to talk about our nationality, right? So if some random person, as global citizen of the world, asks you, who are you or what are you, your first response is probably going to be, I'm a Slovenian, I'm from America, right? Something like that. Right? Only after that we got other parts of your identity, right? This might be I'm a resident of, I don't know, Dobre Polje, right? Or I'm a student, I'm a rocker, I'm a baller, right? So like all your different there's different aspects to your identity. And the biggest question usually isn't which ones you are and which you aren't. The biggest question is which you feel like is the most important, okay? And I think a lot of people don't realize that when it comes to national identity, this wasn't always the case, that national identity was something with which people identified with, right? Historically, people often identified, for example, more with their tribe than they did with their nation, more with their clan. During the Middle Ages, for example, or even during ancient times, often they'd more identified with either the city-state or their ruler, right? And only later we get this concept of nationality, and national identity. Okay, and I'm just going to go quickly through this short history of nationality and national identity. I recognize this might possibly be a little bit controversial, so I'll try to stick to the kind of generally agreed to things, right? So, as I already said, this concept of a nation state or nationality wasn't really something that was present in people, for example, living in 900 BC or even 900 after Christ, right? As I already said, people would more identify with, for example, the ruler they were serving to, right? For example, Europe in the, let's say, 14th century was actually a lot more international than, for example, Europe was 50 years ago, okay? If you look at famous people, like famous musicians, for example, they'd constantly move around, right? They'd constantly serve with different people, serve at different courts, and even when they would maybe keep the name so that people could distinguish between Johann from somewhere and Johann from somewhere, right? But like Haydn, for example, wasn't really German, right? And he moved around a lot. And only later we get this concept of a national identity and of the nation state, okay? And what causes this is that the collapse of the monarchic system, right? Because when we lose the monarchic system, we don't just lose kings, right? And like systems of administration. We lose a whole system of legitimizing government, right? Or we say we have God or some upper, something that institutes this king. He has legitimacy because of this higher body, and that's just how it is, right? But with the French Revolution, what we get is we slowly kind of lose this legitimation, right? We somehow suddenly don't have this God-given right of a ruler to rule, right? And we need to kind of replace this somehow, right? We need to find another legitimate reason why a government has the right to do stuff in the country in which it kind of operates, okay? And the legitimacy we kind of come up with is the concept that it is the nation, the people that give this government power, right? And this is what starts this whole concept of national identity and nationality in Europe, and this is a model that spreads around the world, especially in the 19th and 20th century. And Europe takes this, as you probably know, concept of nationality very, very far, right? Especially in the First World War and the Second World War, where kind of the necessity of war drives nations to radicalize the concept of national identity, right? Where people are not just citizens of a country, but must be prepared for this citizenship to give everything, including their lives, right? But sometimes even worse things than their lives. And after the Second World War, right, where we kind of realize in Europe, okay, nationality is great. We love being, I'm definitely a Slovene, but taking these things too far might perhaps be slightly problematic, as we see in the Second World War, right? What we get is kind of a positive, let's call it positive nationality, and I think post-war Germany kind of embodies this concept, okay? Now, the question is, right, now that we have a broad, let's call it federation, or some people call it federation, some not, of states within the European Union. The question now is, how does the European Union handle this, right? So, will we, or should the European Union try to replace nationality or the identity factor of nationality within people, right? So, should people answer the question who you are with an European or a citizen of the European Union, right? Or should the European Union go into the other option, saying no, so the European Union is important, it will perform a lot of function, but it will not take over this cultural identity aspect of what Europe or what Europeans feel about themselves. And this is what I mean with what I started. There's no really good answer to this, right? I don't think even there is a correct answer to this, right? So Europe needs to decide, or better, we the European citizens need to kind of decide what we want. But we need to realize that the previous speakers talked a lot about economic cooperation and economic federation within the European Union. We need to realize that most of the issues that the European Union faces now are not economic, but quite strictly political in nature, okay? The question of institutional political issues, okay? The question of democratic deficit within the parliament, right? So simply put, the question of why do European institutions have the right to govern us, right? How does this all work, right? Is the European Union too bureaucratic? Is the European Union an overlord without oversight? This is a political, not an economic question. Secondly, defense, for example, is a very strictly political issue, not an economic one, right? And the idea of identity is, of course, very strongly tied to the concept of defense. And lastly, things like citizenship, okay? So the migration crisis, right? So the question of whom and how do we allow to get into the European Union, who gets a European citizenship, these are also political questions. And the important thing to realize is that if we realize that we have mostly political questions to tackle within the European Union, the European Union will have to try and tackle this question of political identity, okay? Because it's very hard to, for example, answer this question of citizenship collectively within the European Union if we don't even want to start tackling the question of European identity and whether we identify as Europeans and can therefore have, let's call it, a European criteria for who can be considered a European citizenship, right? If we decide, no, we will not tackle the question of identity at all, this will be something that is left to the states themselves, right? Then it's going to be very difficult to have a unified European policy on, for example, immigration, right? Because there's a fundamental underlying question of political identity which we haven't answered, okay? Now, the answer of the European Union so far is to go some sort of united in diversity position, right? Where we say, no, the European Union does not have any desire to interject into the political identity of people. We are not the United States of Europe, right? We are simply a kind of not even governing, but coordinating organ that helps European states work better, right? Interestingly, united in diversity was the slogan of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? And historically, this approach did not work very well, but we can probably argue that the Austrians didn't handle this whole concept of diversity particularly well. So the question is, whether, it doesn't really matter whether we decide for a common political identity within Europe or still separate French, German, Slovene, Czech, whatever political identities, there are a couple of approaches, a couple of things we need to do, and the European Union is already doing a lot of it, okay? The first kind of thing we need to tackle is the question of cultural integration, okay? So what do I mean with this? So it doesn't even matter, so whether we try and create a common European political identity or whether we keep our own, it's very important that people kind of realize what the shtick is, okay? So that people realize, for example, that it's okay that people have different political identities within Europe, or that it's okay that I don't identify as a Slovene, but as an European citizen. And what the European Union does a lot is try to have cultural exchange programs, right? A lot of people don't realize that a very important aspect of things like the Erasmus exchange, or even similar projects to the one where we're at right now, where the European youth get to kind of intermingle. A very important aspect of this for the European Union is that young people meet and learn about cultures from other countries, okay? Now this might sound like, oh my God, multiculti, like, oh, it's so nice to meet other people. But a really important thing is that what this prevents is one of the crucial elements that democratic countries need in order to be able to go to war. And that is to dehumanize the opposing side. Right? It's very hard for any country to organize its army to try and kill other people without first convincing their own people that these are not worthy human beings. Okay? And if you've met 7 Spanish people when you were young, it is considerably harder for the government to convince you that Spanish people are murdering barbarians that eat children, right? But I know Juan and he doesn't eat children, okay? These kind of programs that might, for example, at first look at, oh my God, European Union is wasting so much money on students getting drunk on Erasmus, right? Have a lot of very important goals for this cultural integration within Europe. As a second question, when it comes to common political identity within Europe, is the question of defense, right? Because defense because of the historical kind of narrative within which national identity was created, the army is, in a lot of ways, the personification, the liquidification of the concept of national identity, right? And it's going to be very hard for Europe to just stand up and say, there is no more French army, we now only have a European army where French, Germans are kind of all collectively together and fight for Europe, right? Some smaller countries, for example, like Slovenia, will probably have a lesser issue with this, but there's some very strong countries within Europe with very strong kind of nationally bound, military-based administration, which are going to be hard to convince. And I'm not even arguing that we should try to convince, right? I'm not arguing this is bad, but we, when creating, for example, a common defense strategy for Europe, which is probably something Europe should do, need to keep this in mind, right? And we probably need to create a policy which will operationally integrate these armies, where, for example, the French and the German military might use the same equipment, so that it's interchangeable in the field, etc. But it's probably going to be very hard to try and merge them politically, right, or on identity based, and probably there's not really any real reason to do so, right? So this is, if we try to predict it, how common defense policy for the European Union will go, this is probably how it will look like, right? Where these armies will be de facto the same, right? We'll train the same, we'll train together, we'll have the same equipment, etc. But on the surface, we'll have different colored uniforms and different political identities, okay? And what I want kind of, if I kind of close out my thoughts, I think the most important thing that we kind of need to realize is that while national identity is important, and we all should be proud of our countries, and there's a lot of good things that come from it, we need to realize that this is not some sort of set in stone, unchangeable, kind of by God-given, nature-given right or part of your identity that everyone has, right? But it's something that comes from the kind of historical and social context in which we live. And we need to realize that the European Union now is part of this historical and social context, and we should probably start to include Europe as part of our identity. And this is, to a certain extent, already happening, right? If you ask people whether they feel European or national identity, this has changed a lot in the last years, okay? And what we can probably expect in the future is that unless the European Union has some major setbacks and starts to dissolve, that people will more and more start to look at the concept of a European and whether we feel European as an important part of their personal identity. Yeah, thank you very much for listening to our live feed and for all the audience here today. I don't think we're going to answer any. Thank you. I don't think we'll answer any questions on the stream, but we'll have sessions and workshops later, so we can figure out any questions you have based on that. Thanks to everyone listening online. I hope we had at least some interesting things to say. If not, flame us on social media. And goodbye.